So I want to introduce our moderator for this panel is Jamal Martin, who joined MAS as a Ralph Menpeace Fellow. He's going to be leaving in September, I just found out. But he's from Rutgers Law School. And we know, always, even looking at the earlier discussion from the panel before, that looking at the law, the rules of the game are really important. And so preservation is a component of that, but in New York, it's always going back to looking to the structure that makes those laws and how you play against them or with them to sort of get what you want. So it's a pleasure to introduce you to Jamal Martin. Jamal.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Pronunciation is Jamel, but of course, we just met. Don't worry. But good morning, everyone. This is panel 2, and panel 2 is about the government's role in preserving cultural and historical assets. So thank you for this esteemed panelist group to join me here on stage. And I just want to go over the goals of the panel. The panel is set up to explore the legal strategies that really shape the government strategy in concerning our built environment to the communities that we love and hold dear in New York. So we're going to address that. We're also going to talk and discuss the government's role in making sure that accountability and transparency is given to the public in our review processes. And probably what's the most important for a lot of you here is whether communities actually have a genuine voice in deciding what's worth preserving in our communities. So that's what we're going to address. But before we get into that, I just want us to all get to know these panelists that we have here today. We're going to start with some light questions. We have first Shirley Worrell, founder and CEO of Caribbean. We have Kathy Howell, who's the director of community preservation at New York SHPO. Then we have John Mannion, who is the senior counsel for DCP. And we have Mark Silberman, general counsel for LPC. All right. Yep, round of applause. So the first question is just to briefly introduce yourselves, but then also fancy us with what is your vision for historic preservation in 2024? If there's no budget restrictions, there's no administrative red tape, what's your personal vision for it in 2024 and beyond? So Shirley, if you would like to start first, feel free.
Sure. Thank you, Shelley.
Shelley. We're all learning to get to know each other.
No worries. So good morning, everyone. My name is Shelley Worrell, and I am the founder of I Am Caribbean, which is a cultural arts organization working at the intersection of Caribbean culture, community, and commerce. By commerce, we very specifically mean the small businesses that we support, whether that's a micro business, or a business within the footprint of Little Caribbean. So a huge part of my work over the last 7 years has been the advocacy as well as the ongoing development of Little Caribbean, which is in Flatbush, Brooklyn. That's where I live. Was born there and have lived most of my life. It is the first and only Little Caribbean at the moment in the world. And this was an effort that I started after leaving my job in corporate. I was working in tech at Google and started spending a lot more time on the ground in Flatbush, walking the corridors. Luckily, I not only have traveled extensively in the Caribbean, but also spent my first year of grad school studying hospitality and tourism management. So very quickly saw that we had a lot of cultural and community assets that were being underserved, whether economically, culturally, even I would say, since this panel is partially political, I would say even politically. So I started asking questions of council members, other stakeholders, like, why isn't there a Little Caribbean? We have I think most recently I read somewhere that there was like 8 Chinatowns in New York. We have 2 Little Italys. The Caribbean population being 20% of New York. Why don't we have a Little Caribbean here? No one could answer the question. So the first thing we did is that map that you see out with Kenya and Kermaya. I created that map along with someone that I knew that was a placemaker, urban planner, and then started to sort of start the effort to develop Little Caribbean. So for me, my vision in 2024 is that I think a lot of the balls that we have and the seeds that we've been planting are now starting to bloom and germinate. So it really would be that it really realizes its full potential for the entire community, that there's a sustainable future for Caribbean immigrants and their descendants in the neighborhood that we were born, raised, and grew up in. So thank you.
Of course.
Thanks. I'm Kathy Howe. I'm with the New York State Historic Preservation Office, and we're thrilled, myself and my colleague Olivia, who's speaking later, we're really happy that HDC invited us down here today from Albany to kind of share a little bit of our state perspective and what the state perspective of our Historic Preservation Office here in New York City. I've been with the SHPO now 25 years. And what does the SHPO do? Just to give a little background, we oversee lots of different programs, state and national registers, listings, surveys, both homeowner and rehabilitation commercial tax credit programs. We have a New York State Historic Business Registry, which I'll talk about, that's fairly new for legacy businesses. We run the Certified Local Government Program. We'll mention that. Of course, New York City's LPC is a CLG, a Certified Local Government, and we do a lot of community outreach as well. I've had the pleasure earlier in my career to work on a lot of sort of cultural related historic districts. From Chinatown, Little Italy, Lower East Side. I'm seeing Andrew sitting out there. Two Bridges, Sugar Hill Historic District, and so on. And also working more recently with the survey efforts, and my colleague Kathleen Frank with the New York City LGBT History Project. So I'm talking about a lot of the different cultural things we're involved with. And then right now we're preparing this September to take forward a very large Washington Heights historic district, part of which will focus on the Dominican history of that district. As far as my vision, I kind of have three quick visions here to share. We talked a lot about sort of housing, affordable housing in New York City, and we do get involved at the SHPO through rehabilitation tax credits, a 20% rehab tax credit if you're in a qualifying census tract, an additional 20% state tax credit on top of that. But I think one of the challenges that we have with housing, I think the SHPO plays a role with that through the tax credit program. But I think one of the challenges that I would like to see addressed, it's not going to happen in 24, hopefully sometime in the future, is to readdress perhaps the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. These are standards that come down from on high from the National Park Service. They're tried and true standards for rehabilitation. But I think some changes could be made to those pertinent to interiors of buildings, particularly interiors of buildings in historic districts, and some more flexibility to be provided for those standards for tax credit projects, which may help open up more opportunities for housing and affordable housing. Two other things I do want to do a shout out. We're talking a lot about spaces, buildings, but let's also think about our maritime heritage. We have a lot of waterfront here, not just here in New York City, but upstate, the Erie Canal, and so on. And so I think part of our cultural landscape has to do with these waterfronts. And that's very important to think about. Certainly New York City's come under a lot of pressure, redevelopment along the waterfront, but also what about those waterfront resources? So we've got boats, don't forget about boats, and lighthouses and a lot of maritime history. We recently received not a very large grant, but a grant from the National Park Service. It was under $300,000. And we are giving these out as re-grants to throughout the state maritime resources. Could include boats. But that is a fraction of what that's going to cover. We had applications that came in for $23 million. an ask. So I think one of our hopes and dreams would be the preservation community kind of rally around, get your elected officials in the state legislature to push for more funding for maritime cultural heritage. And then last and not least, we were talking a bit about parks, but think about cemeteries, burial grounds. These are also parks. It's open space. And these are neglected resources as well. So we would like to, there's about 6,000 cemeteries in New York State, and we would like to hope that in the future we can get some sort of grant program, because there's really nothing now available to cemeteries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, folks. John Mangan, Head of Housing Division at City Planning. So every waking moment of 2024 is spent working on the City of Yes for housing opportunity zoning changes, which aim to enable a little more housing in every neighborhood across the city, from the lowest density to the highest density. I don't know if you've seen, but the numbers came out. We have the lowest net rental vacancy rate since 1968, 1.4%. It's tough out there. The idea is, it's a big city. If we create a little more housing everywhere, we can create a lot of housing overall without, overtaxing infrastructure in any one neighborhood, without changing neighborhood character dramatically in any one neighborhood. If we all do it together, everybody from Manhattan to those lowest density districts in the outer lying boroughs, we can get a lot done. Also, related, important, is our big initiatives around faith-based organizations citywide. There's, as came up on the previous panel, there are so many churches, synagogues, other houses of worship across the city that they want to use their properties in ways that further their missions, but can also create housing or provide other essential services to all New Yorkers. And we are doing absolutely everything we can to support those congregations across the city to do that. So I hope I get a chance to talk about all those things during the panel. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Mark Silberman, General Counsel of the Landmarks Commission. I think for the commission, we will continue to do sort of what we have done historically and what we have identified as priorities currently and for the future, and that is to continue designating and regulating, but we need to sort of make sure that historic preservation reflects the values that are evolving over time. So equity and diversity in designations and regulation, climate change, housing and density. How can historic preservation address these things within the framework of the law and the framework of preserving and protecting historic resources? So that's really about what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all for that. So we got to know all the panelists. So one more question for all of you is, how has historic properties provided you a sense of community, right? And however you define your community. And if you feel free, if answering that question with a story about your favorite New York City or New York State for Kathy, of a cultural site or a store or any type of community practice that ties you to a sense of community. And feel free to start. You could start, Shelley, or you could start, Kathy, it doesn't matter.
So if you say a store, one of the things that we do is we offer tours, walking tours in Little Caribbean, and we offered one yesterday for National Geographic because we'll be launching a walking tour in partnership with them. And we started the tour at one of my favorite historic places in Little Caribbean, which is Allen's Bakery. It's a bakery. Yeah. Are you familiar?
Yeah, I am.
You love their currants rolls, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So for me, Allen's has been it's what we call a legacy business. It's been around for my entire life. They've been around since the 60s. I was not born in the 60s. I was born in the 70s. And it's going on a fourth generation, family-run business. And it's a really beautiful thing when you're, whether you're there just to patronize and pick up some currants rolls or hard dough bread, to see that the whole family is still involved. The children of Allen's, their grandchildren, and I'm sure pretty soon it'll be their great-grandchildren. So for me, I look at culture and these sites as through the lens of commerce. On that block is also the Bay Market, which has not been around that long as Allen's Bakery, but is quickly becoming one of those legacy businesses within the neighborhood. It's a West Indian-owned West Indian market that imports their produce from the Caribbean, from Grenada. And I had the privilege over the last couple of weeks to actually visit their estate in Grenada and to see some of the fruits and spices that they import to the neighborhood. So for me, I would say Allen's and the Bay Market.
Great choice.
Well, this isn't necessarily in my neighborhood, but it's one of the projects I worked on, and I think it kind of speaks to us in terms of cultural properties and important places, spaces. And one of my favorite sites out on Staten Island is the Our Lady of Mount Carmel Grotto. It was built starting in the 1930s by members of this Italian-American immigrant group, a mutual aid society. And it's an ongoing sort of almost folk art design. It's not, well, I shouldn't say it's fixed in stone. It is sort of concrete, stone. And it's this amazing amalgam of borrowed materials from bicycle reflectors and broken pieces of glass and mirrors and marbles and, of course, statues of saints, and then also living plants as well. And I think what is special about this, and we worked years ago, I think one of the things when we talk about cultural heritage, and we need to really work closely as preservationists with folklorists. So in this particular project, this has so much meaning to this neighborhood, the Rosebank neighborhood on Staten Island, and we worked with a folklorist. I don't think he's here, but Dr. Joe Shiora. He's at, I think, Queens College, CUNY. And so it was interesting to get his perspective, his oral history interviews of the members there and what this place means to them. And I think he explained that it's sort of the history and preservation of this grotto. It is not necessarily fixed, but instead it's part of an ongoing process of the cultural memory of this group and of community building. So I think a lot of these places, including what you were just talking about, Shelley, it's that community memory and ongoing community building. And so I think, so while this was built, starting in the 1930s by Italian-American immigrants, today that neighborhood is changing. We have a lot of Catholics from Latin America who settled in there, and they've kind of helped and adopted the grotto as well and contributed to it. So I think it speaks a lot to what that means to that neighborhood, little neighborhood on Staten Island.
Wow, I got to go to the Allen's Bakery and the grotto.
Yep. You're up next. I'm
a housing policy guy. I live on the Lower East Side, Hillman Houses. It's right by Two Bridges, which is just this amazing living museum of New York City housing history. You've got obviously the railroads and the old law tenements and the new law tenements, and then you see the government starting to get involved in housing production. Knickerbocker Village, some of the earliest government support for affordable housing, public housing from every era, Vladeck houses from the 1930s up through the 30s, through the 30s, the 40s, 50s, 60s. The slab towers. You've got Mitchell Llamas. You've got amalgamated dwellings built by the Garment Workers Union in the 30s. HUD 202s, 235s, 237s, 421A, LIHTC. It's all there. And it's just such a housing policy palimpsest, and it's alive. It's still changing and growing over time. And so I can't imagine a better place for me to be in New York City. I really love it.
Great choice.
So I have a sort of a different view. I'm taking sort of a macro view. I came to New York in the 80s and have lived in Park Slope ever since I came here in a few different places. So I've lived there. It was chosen simply because it was affordable. That's simply why I was there, and I loved it, and it was great. And but my background is as an environmental lawyer. So for me, I was just sort of in the city, and I happened to befriend a guy named Matt Postal, which I think many people here know. Matt and I became good friends and spent many, many, many weekends biking around the city with Matt, who's an architectural historian, and a food guru, pointing out all these places, having these destinations. And then I moved to the Landmarks Commission without really a preservation per se background. I was a land use and environmental lawyer background. But through Matt and through Landmarks preservation work, you learn to read the city, just as I had read the landscape as a naturalist and as an environmental lawyer. Learning to read your neighborhood, read the history that's there, just as John sort of laid it out, is, I think, one of the great gifts of historic preservation to me. And I think one of the things that the Landmarks Commission strives to do through its reports and through its interactive maps, and that ability to look and understand something about the past through the physical culture that's left.
So what I'm getting from your responses, which were great insights of different parts of the city, is that 2024, communities are trying to understand how to protect these intangible heritage and places that contribute to their neighborhood's history and culture. And I guess my question for everyone is, how can we continue to promote and preserve these cultural places for those memories that we're all discussing right now, that define a sense of place for everyone, that don't necessarily fit into the traditional guidelines of material architectural integrity, kind of what you were hinting at, Mark. So I guess anyone can start with that question, but what are the tools to help with that, to help promote and protect those places that may not fit so nicely into what we know as preservable, quote unquote? Make sense? Okay.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's very aligned with our work. So for us, I think one of the we have several tools in our toolkit, and I think number one was mapping it, right, and saying this is where it is and this is why it's important. So here are the boundaries and the actual coordinates. And we went as far as we actually put it on Google Maps. I remember the whole neighborhood almost tripped out. They were they woke up one day and they were like, oh, Little Caribbean is on the map officially. And what that meant is every time you ordered Uber Eats or DoorDash or a Lyft or Uber, you actually saw that. And it's actually one of my, I still am delighted every time I'm receiving a package or I'm in an Uber and I see Little Caribbean on the map. And it's also on Apple Maps as well. So number one is, I think, mapping. For us, it's also through culturally relevant programming. So we're known for our events, whether they're a smaller scale or a larger scale event. So our events go anywhere from 12 to 25,000 people. So placemaking and, sort of really celebrating our culture has been a very, very integral part of our work. And then also forging partnerships like the one we have with HGC, the one we have with Brooklyn Botanic. So through that relationship, we have 2 site-specific installations. There's Plants of Little Caribbean, which is a summer culinary garden. And then they also have in their conservatory an installation called Trees of Little Caribbean. So they actually have mango trees and breadfruit trees and cocoa trees, a lot of the trees that you find in the Caribbean. And it's called, this installation is now called Trees of Little Caribbean. But not only, for me, a couple of years ago when we were approached by the garden about these projects, I was like, well, that's really cool. That's nice that you're planting, these herbs and spices that we cook with and that we love. But what if we did some really, of course the programming was already there. So we have fetes, we have parties in the garden and other didactic events. But what I was able to convince them to do is to, on each of the specimens, to create signage that told you where you can go in Little Caribbean to buy that particular fruit, vegetable, or spice. And then some of them also have recipes with that contain that fruit, vegetable, or spice. So if you see a cocoa, then you're like, this is how I make cocoa tea, and this is where I can go buy cocoa. I can go to the Bay Market to buy the cocoa balls. If you see a sorrel flower, then you can go and buy sorrel here at this hibiscus brew cafe, and then here's a recipe of how you can make sorrel. So that's, I think, a very powerful way of engaging with the community to be represented in a larger institution and to preserve our culture and heritage.
Great.
Okay, well, I certainly, with the State Historic Preservation Office, you have your standard tools, which you mentioned, and of course, survey, getting things on the map, and we have a cultural resource information system where we have something like over 400,000 properties mapped with some basic baseline of information in our cultural resource information system. Obviously, listing properties on the National Register, survey reports, et cetera. But I think we're talking a little bit more about the intangible aspects of these places. And so I think, as I mentioned before, we have the SHPO has a very good working relationship, and I'm going to keep harping on this, with folklorists. And for example, we've done a lot of work with city lore. We recently completed a survey of the very fragile casitas scattered throughout the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, leading to the listing of the Casita Rincon Criollo. So that's actually on its way to listing. So I think there are other organizations, when we talk about government groups aligning and cooperating and reaching out to other groups. I think that's a good case there, where we can talk to other groups like City Lore. And I also think there's a lot that we could learn on the intangible side from what UNESCO's done, right? I mean, they have a whole list of 5 different areas for intangible cultural heritage. And they have you can designate a list. So like the baguette culture of France is on their list. Interesting things like that, like the craftsmanship of making watches in Switzerland, Congolese Roomba dance in the Congo, things like that. So how do we, as preservationists, start to think broader about those cultural traditions and practices? And I think if we look at UNESCO and sort of their 4 or 5 broad areas being, for intangible, it's the oral traditions and expressions, language, right? We're losing languages. Performing arts, obviously, social practices, rituals, festive events. A lot of neighborhoods do traditionally these festivals. We have another area is knowledge and practices concerning nature, the universe, religion, and so on. And how can that inform the work that we do in historic preservation, and then obviously traditional craftsmanship. So I think as we're doing our traditional stuff, National Register nominations, surveys, how can we creatively loop some of this into our work? Also, we do a lot of, and Olivia will probably be talking more about this later, we do thousands of consultation reviews because there's a state or federal hook, right? We have to review a project, and sometimes there's an adverse effect. And what kind of, you've explored all alternatives unfortunately, to demolition. What kind of creative mitigation measures can you get out of something that is sadly, maybe going to bite the dust? Are there things we can do rather than the traditional historic American building survey, which is great, Habs hair drawings, history is important, but what could we do in terms of other kind of recordation, documentation, whether it's musical recordings, something artistic, poetry, and so on. So I think I would, and that's maybe a vision too I have for us to think more broadly in those terms. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks. So if we want to preserve neighborhoods for people, I think it's also really important to make sure that our neighborhoods can accommodate, growth and change. I'll give an example. I went on a couple Wednesdays ago. I went on a site visit to a Baptist church in low-density Jamaica, and I talked to the pastor there, and he told me how in recent decades, his congregation has dwindled from about 200 families to maybe about 40. And I said, oh, the pandemic. And he's like, no, a little bit. But it's mostly just the fact that, like, the older folks, they pass on. And then the younger folks can't afford to live in the neighborhood anymore. They've moved to Atlanta, he said. Like, a lot of people have just been heading down south. And so his congregation is being priced out of their neighborhoods. And so when it comes to preserving, East Flatbush is under a ton of pressure, obviously, too. That's probably one of the best examples of a neighborhood in New York City that's under a ton of pressure. And pressure goes to East Flatbush. It's pushed there from other parts of the city that can't build any housing, or people who can't find housing that they can afford end up in East Flatbush. Similarly in Jamaica, in low-density areas across the city. And so preserving the low-density neighborhoods, that, for instance, that we love for the people who live there involves things like enabling accessory dwelling units. It involves things like a little more floor area in neighborhoods like that to accommodate maybe 2-family homes. It involves, like, looking to New York City's past and bringing back these modest multifamily buildings, 3, 5-story buildings that are all over low-density New York, but they were built in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. We outlawed them in the 1960s. And so a big part of our efforts right now at city planning are to address the problem that Pastor Mitchell is facing in Jamaica. His congregation can't afford to live there anymore. Enabling ADUs so people can age in place in neighborhoods. Enabling modest multifamily housing so the kids can afford to buy, a starter home in the neighborhood they grew up in. And so that's really important. I know that the impulse sometimes is just to, like, clamp down to try to preserve neighborhoods for people by clamping down on any change in development, things like that. Unfortunately, conversely, sometimes those are the places where you see the most pressure on the people who live there, the most displacement pressure on places that can't flex, that can't grow, that can't accommodate a little bit to preserve a space for the people who live there. And so that's the way I think about these issues.
Thank you.
I think intangible sort of culture and landmarks pose real challenges to the Landmarks Preservation Commission due to the law. We can't regulate use, and so we can't mandate that any particular business stay there, any particular use stay there. We regulate physical culture, and to the extent that something isn't represented by physical culture, it's difficult for us because once landmarking happens as a tool, a whole regulatory regime is automatically applied. And it was funny, I was talking to Kathy earlier, and she said something to me about her neighborhood was just designated. She lives in the neighborhood. And she said something to me I hear almost every day, and certainly every time I go out and talk to people. Oh, I love being in the historic district. Thank God I did something, X, put a new roof on, put a door in, change the windows, you name it, before landmarking happened, because I could never afford to do it now. It's funny, but that's a terrible outcome. It's a terrible outcome that the landmarks laws is seen as imposing, in some cases crippling or difficult challenges. Now, we try very hard, and we have a whole bunch of rules. We allow substitute materials. We do all these things. But the law requires that we look at things, is it appropriate, right? That's what we have to decide. So for us, landmarking is not really the number one approach to how you deal with intangible culture. And so what we've tried to do is do other things by bringing knowledge, making knowledge within the agency accessible through the designation reports in districts or through our story maps that describe, path to freedom or LGBTQ history. That's the way we're trying to sort of foster that. But it's a real challenge for us.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to move on to community participation because I think there is a lot happening throughout the city in terms of initiatives that the community would like to have a voice in. So what are your suggestions on how the public can gather that information, but then also make those informed decisions when proposals like the City of Yes for housing is being proposed, or the rollout of 5G towers is being implemented in people's communities and they want to have a say in it. So what are your suggestions on getting that information and then collecting their thoughts to have an impact and make sure that it's being rolled out or that initiative is what the community needs and addresses it. We can start from anywhere. Yep.
I'm going to hop in
John,
just
go
because,
ahead.
As I've mentioned, we're in the midst of a big rollout of our housing opportunity citywide zoning changes to enable more housing everywhere. As part of that, I've done well over 100 meetings, and those operate on different valences. We're talking to practitioners in the field, the affordable housing developers, for instance, or the nonprofit organizations that work in the housing and land use space. We're talking to civic associations, of course. We're talking to city council members. We're talking to anybody who has a stake in these housing changes, which honestly is everybody in the city. So if anybody out there wants to know more about this than they do now, I'm happy to point you to resources. I'm happy to set up meetings to talk with you. We're still a couple months away from formal public review here, at which time we expect to do literally hundreds of meetings with community boards. And I can say, I've been at city planning about 10 years. I started at city planning with a citywide housing text amendment that was, smaller in scale, I would say, than this one. And we did not have the infrastructure in place at that time to do a year or more worth of outreach before it hit public review. And so when it hit public review, there was this enormous backlash. And in my view, totally reasonable from the community boards who were basically surprised by it, didn't understand it, hadn't been briefed on it in advance. And so it's just very gratifying 10 years later with this approach to be able to just have a ton of space, a ton of time to meet with stakeholders, to get feedback, to incorporate it into the proposal, and to ensure absolutely that when it goes into formal public review, that nobody who cares is surprised by anything that's in there. And I hope that will pay dividends where people can see where we're coming from, why we're doing what we're doing, and just one last thing. So gratifying, I think it was yesterday, 2 days ago, to see an op-ed that surprised me by Elizabeth Goldstein from MAS. So, in the past, MAS as an organization has sometimes been skeptical of things that city planning has been up to, whether it's neighborhood rezonings or different zoning changes to accommodate certain types of development, things like that. But just if you put the work in and talk to people, again and again and again, I'm hopeful that, like MAS, folks can come around and ultimately support what we think is a very reasonable and common sense approach to enable a little more housing everywhere to deal with some of the human consequences of our housing shortage. Sorry to be long-winded. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, I have another perspective on this. So we, during the pandemic, it came to our attention that there's an African burial ground on Bedford and Church Avenue. And I feel very, very well informed, as a community member. And I feel like I'm also surrounded with folks who are pretty well, informed, whether, on multiple levels. And no one that I spoke to knew that this was an African burial ground. At the time, that particular site was being slated for development of affordable housing. So of course, we sort of launched this, informal campaign to sort of get more members of the community to be aware that this actually was a sacred site that was being slated for development. Fortunately, since then, it's now no longer going to be developed. But I would say that, a lot of times through these city processes, some of the information doesn't get through to everyone in the community. Even those who are very engaged, who are very informed, and even those who are not as informed, I think should also have a voice and a seat at the table, as Shirley Chisholm would say. So, I think it's really important that, of course, as constituents, as people who live here in New York City, that we remain active. But I think also the city, whether it's landmarks or city planning, does a better job to actually reach, everyone in the community, especially if you have something as large as City of Yes and or, having a building built on an actual slave site or historic site.
So, piggybacking off that point, how has engaging with the community changed? How has engagement changed with the technology in your line of work? How do you keep the public engaged with what you do, your day-to-day responsibilities? Anyone can tackle that one.
So I can say briefly, in recent years, we have an actual community planning and civic engagement division at city planning now that has been amazing in coordinating all these meetings with groups across the city. So just having a division that's dedicated to that now makes everything so much better. And I have to say that experimenting with virtual meetings, in-person meetings, hybrid meetings, and everything in between has been a good way to reach more people. Because if you only have in-person meetings, then you hear, what about folks who don't have the time to travel to the meeting? If you only have virtual meetings, you hear, well, this isn't as effective a way to participate as it is if we're in the room and you can see us. And so making sure that we're doing everything along that spectrum at different times of day, during the day, at night, so that it just as part of that effort, as you mentioned, to try to reach as many people as we can. And I think in the 10 years I've been at city planning, I think we've gotten a lot better at that. It just feels a lot better.
Yeah, I'd follow up with that and agree that I think those in-person and hybrid and other kinds of meetings are really important. And Stephen Thompson, who's many of you know, does a lot of these meetings for the Landmarks Commission. And I also think it's really good to get information, make it accessible. So starting about maybe 8 years ago, the commission really started putting a tremendous amount of information about what happens at the commission on the website. So you're interested in obviously what's designated. There's a landmarks map, there's designation reports are a click away, but there's also information on every permit, even at pending applications, violations. It's there, and we've also started sending out information proactively to community boards and other interested parties to help them sort of know in advance, or have easier access to this information. I think that's critical for allowing members of the public to participate in what we do at the Landmarks Commission.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it's really important for I remember Olivia and I were up in Albany. We get about 11,000 projects, compliance, environmental review projects a year throughout the state. So we're maybe not quite as in touch with everything that's happening here in New York City to the micro level, but I think what's really important is to everyone, the communities, to make your voice heard. To us at the SHPO, if you know of something that's coming down the pike, let us know. If there's something in terms of like a cultural history about a particular special place that maybe we are not aware about, to share that information and be proactive, because we will say, we were discussing this earlier, that can make the needle move a little bit in terms of the SHPO compliance type consultation reviews. Is if we know, there's some voices out there, this is important to this particular community, that helps us and helps inform our decision hearing from the community.
Thank you for that. So my next question for everyone is, what are some highlights in the differences in how the public engages with your agencies, but then also how does the agencies interact with one another when considering public review opportunities, which also helps the public understand and have informed decisions and comments for members like Shelley, who's just a community member, that impact of agency interactions, what is that benefit or differences in how you comment on public review opportunities? And then also from the public's perspective, how is those opportunities opened up for them, but then also different from that?
if that makes sense. Go ahead.
I mean, I think from the I sort of understand that question as sort of talking about environmental review opportunities
Yes.
and sort of larger questions like that. And I think what's really important for people to understand is the Landmarks Commission is not a lead agency in any environmental review. We are an expert agency. We're there to help, DCP and city planning and HPD and whoever, a BSA, who's ever going through the environmental process, who's the decision maker, the discretionary decision maker. We're there to help them identify potential impacts of their decisions. And so that's what we do. And in doing that is something that's distinct from us deciding that what we find is thereby and therefore a priority for us. So we identify historic resources, and and so that's taken care of in the context of the environmental review. But the commission then has to that resource goes into our own research department, who then makes priorities and does other things. So there's no direct link between finding something is a historic resource and the commission deciding that it's something that we're going to make a priority. Because the commission's a small agency, and priorities are how we sort of organize the various things that we think are potentially eligible. So that's one way I would answer it.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I guess I would say it's similar at the SHPO. I mean, remember, we're here under the National Little 101, Preservation 101, under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, with amendments in 1980, formed SHPOs in every state in the country. And so part of our charge is to review projects that are federally funded, permitted, licensed. So those projects come to us from various federal agencies, and then we have our parallel law at the State Historic Preservation Act, if there's state funding involved. So that's how projects come to us. Those 11,000 a year.
And I could say we work really. Oh, sorry. Were you?
Yep.
We work really closely with other agencies, not only on environmental review, but also on proposal development more generally. And I love taking the opportunity to point that out. And I think it gives members of the public assurances that, when we hear concerns, say, about what about fire safety or what about flooding with accessory dwelling units, if you're proposing that in low density districts, to say, we have a weekly meeting with FDNY and with DEP, and we are carefully working through all the very real health and safety issues if you're enabling a small accessory dwelling along with a 1 or 2 family home in low density districts. Similarly, we're doing a few things that directly touch on preservation of buildings or landmarks themselves, and we've worked with LPC on that as well. For instance, I think many folks in this room know and love our adaptive reuse regulations in New York City, which enable non-residential buildings to convert to residential. Unfortunately, it only applies in a limited geography, Manhattan below 60th Street, parts of Brooklyn and Queens along the East River, a few other places. And you have to be a pre-61 building. We are proposing to just expand those adaptive reuse regs citywide, so that you're hitting those, convents and monasteries and, old schools, abandoned hospitals or whatever, and throughout the city, that those buildings, instead of being torn down or moldering, and being demolished through neglect, can potentially be repurposed as housing for people in these places, for instance. Landmark TDRs came up on the last panel. That is enabling landmarks to sell unused development rights to neighboring property owners. We're simplifying that a bit. We're streamlining it to enable a slightly broader, we're proposing to anyway, to enable a slightly broader transfer radius anywhere on the block or across the street from that block, and saying you don't have to go through a full ULURP to do that, especially if you don't need any zoning changes on the receiving site, in a way that we think will create real opportunities for landmarks that just haven't had them. Over the last 60 years or whatever this program has existed, we've only had like a dozen transfers. I'll close with an anecdote here. Talked to a landmark church in Crown Heights a month ago, and it's one of these churches that we all know. They need repairs to the roof. The congregation can't support the ongoing maintenance of the landmark themselves. When I showed them what the potential consequences of our changes to the landmark TDR program were, they were ecstatic because it gave them realistic transfer opportunities where, you could even have multiple receiving sites bidding over those unused development rights from this Episcopal church in Crown Heights in a way that could provide a real lifeline to this landmark and, support the historic preservation that we're all, here for.
Thank you. I think that's a good transition into climate change and thinking about how we are including historic properties and also historic districts in our disaster preparedness preparation and responses for the city and state, such as, the local law 97 and thinking about building emissions, which is a great example of it. And John kind of hit on just adaptive reuses. So we could do story time one more time. What's your favorite example of a historic building reuse and thoughtful retrofit to help with climate change preparedness and retrofitting for building emissions? And we'll go from there. Whoever would like to start that. Kathy, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'm not sure about climate change, but it is a pier.
Okay.
So Pier 57, I think is pretty amazing. It's really one of my favorites of adaptive reuse projects, at least in Manhattan. Worked on the nomination years ago, this engineering marvel. And it took that long, over 20 years to get this project up and moving, this innovative private-public partnership. And of course, it's wonderful because they were able to reuse on the pier shed the telescoping lift doors that you see there. And they were able to use the original truck ramp and all of that and kind of go ahead and restore the original waiting room. So I think that would be my favorite sort of adaptive reuse on the waterfront.
Okay, I don't think I've been there.
Should do well as a pier.
So I sort of sent a email around the office for asking, what do people think? And there was too many choices really to come up with. The Ice House, which is an old adaptive reuse in Tribeca, is one that kept coming up as a dramatic example of a building that had no windows. It was a very tall building, had no windows, that the commission, in order to adaptively reuse it and give it a new life, actually allowed windows to be put in all over the building. And that's pre-energy efficiency and resiliency, but it's an example of what you need to do. But I think what people kept on coming back to was all of the work that happens now in retrofits of energy retrofits of row houses and homeowners and their ability to make their buildings very energy efficient with almost no exterior changes to the building. And the last thing I'll just point out is I think that office conversions are going to be a big opportunity. And I think what Kathy mentioned earlier, all of us, the New York City Landmarks Commission and a lot of preservation groups have urged the Advisory Council to really let up on regulation of interior changes to allow those retrofits really to happen in the future.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I have a wish for one, an adaptive, something on my wish list, which would be the Sears building on Bedford Avenue. It's a huge site. It's just behind King's Theater, very close to my house, which is a new historic district. And I think a lot of my neighbors as well would really welcome that Sears building that is landmarked to be adaptively reused.
Okay, I'm gonna pause my questioning and open it up to the public to see if you have anything to ask the panelists. I'm gonna go with the man with the green and glasses, raising his hand with the pencil.
Thank you. Howard Euro, Save Gould Library. For Mr. Manjan, is it? Do I have the pronunciation right? First of all, congratulations on branding. City of Yes is brilliant. Brilliant. But you've been selling it through the politics and the procedure this morning. But an audience like this has very serious problems with the substance of City of Yes. Very serious problems to the core values. Now, I'm not going to, you can't defend City of Yes But I just want to let you know that that is the case. And hopefully the commission will have to deal with that, a very heavy barrage coming back from people like us.
Gotcha. I mean, I recognize that the politics are very challenging. Is at least some of you are probably aware that I would say the housing market in New York City is like the #1 soul crusher of trying to like continue to exist in the city. And as was made very clear from our fair housing reporting, Where We Live a couple years back, led by HPD, mandated by HUD at the federal level, the fundamental driver of all the things that make the New York City housing market miserable, the skyrocketing rents, the gentrification pressure, the displacement pressure, the overcrowding we see, illegal conversions, homelessness, the fact that landlords have all the power, that tenants have no options, 1.41 net rental vacancy rate. Landlords know that. They can raise rents, they can rent out apartments with like, you know, the bathroom ceiling falling down on you. All those things are just fundamentally driven by the fact that we don't have enough housing in this city. And that's a survival issue. That's a baseline survival issue. And so I hope that everybody can at least agree that we have to come together and figure out a way to enable more housing in the city. The approach that we are taking is extremely cognizant of the political challenges by people who live in their neighborhoods and love their neighborhoods and don't want to see their neighborhoods change that much. And that's why we're taking, for the first time ever, it seems simple, it seems obvious, we've never done it, we are taking as wide a geographic scope as possible. Literally every neighborhood in the city that allows residential, we're making minor incremental changes to enable a little more housing there. And that is the absolute best that I think we can do to create a lot of housing while being absolutely cognizant of all the concerns that crowds like this would have about neighborhood change, neighborhood character, demolitions, redevelopments, things like that. So I'm very happy to make that case in community boards, audiences like this, before the commission and the city council, and I really hope that this is the year that we can get something done.
Thank you. I'm gonna go with the lady with the black glasses right here. Yep, with me, eye contact.
I have a question for you, John. I've often heard it told, I don't know if it's an urban myth, that the city of New York has 50,000 apartments around the city that are warehoused. Can you address that topic? Because I live in Harlem, in a low-density area, in a landmark district, and I know that the city has a certain limited capacity to be a viable, environmentally friendly space if we just build. There's limits on water, there's limits on air, there's limits on transportation.
It's a great question. The vacancy issue comes up fairly frequently. I can say, like I said, the overall net rental vacancy rate in New York City, 1.41%, the lowest it's been since 1968. The NYCHA vacancy rate, as low as it's ever been. We work closely with NYCHA on that as well. The HVS, the Housing and Vacancy Survey, led by HPD, also indicates that the rent stabilized apartment vacancy rates are as low as they've ever been. While it's always true that there are going to be some vacant apartments out there, even if you could put people in every single vacant apartment out there, drive that vacancy rate down to 0, which is not a thing that can actually happen in a functioning housing market, we would still need, probably 500,000 units to make the New York City housing market palpably more tenant friendly. So yes, every unit counts. NYCHA is working on it, HPD is working on it, city planning is working on it, and making sure that every unit that can be occupied is occupied, but that is just one part of many different things that we have to do in order to change the story in New York City housing.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. We're gonna go here, the guy with the glasses, make eye contact, and then after one more after him.
Good. Thank you very much. Mark, I was wondering if you could explain how the City of Yes would impact the powers of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, or if it's completely separate and the Landmarks Preservation Commission would retain all of its power and still be able to regulate all of the properties it can regulate today.
The simple fact is that it doesn't change anything about how the Landmarks Commission regulates. So just as current zoning may, in any particular area, permit a very large, building, the Landmarks Commission is not bound to approve a building of such size. And it's, our law says we look at appropriateness. And so, I think that City of Yes is obviously an important initiative for the city citywide, and the Landmarks Commission will continue to review applications in historic districts for their appropriateness, as it always has.
One or two more questions, man with the mask right here. No? Good? Yep. And then I'll come back to this side. What, the guy with the mask right here? Yes.
My issue to the panel, affordable housing, does it exist? We had the issue of the Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn. That was being done back in Patterson's days. It's Governor Patterson, if you don't know who that is. The issue is, when will that be finished? And all the affordable housing in the city will be recognized by the Housing Commission, Housing Bureau inside of City Hall.
Great question. Part of the housing opportunity initiatives, we haven't talked much about medium and high density districts, but the major initiative there is called Universal Affordability Preference. Let's take the zoning as it is today, hold market rate constant, and float affordable and supportive FARs a little bit higher. We'll know by the end of the year where we're at. This would mean, for the first time, across all medium and high density districts in New York City, if you wanted to max out the potential of a lot, you would have to provide permanently affordable housing. Okay, affordable for whom? Today, our inclusionary programs in the zoning create units at 80% AMI, area median income, and only 80% AMI. I don't know if you guys know this, AMIs in recent years have climbed and climbed and climbed to the point where 80% AMI isn't what it used to be. It's over $100,000 now, just over, for a family of 3. So for this program, in order to qualify to build a little bit bigger, we can do significantly better than 80% AMI in the zoning, ironclad requirement, and we can enable income averaging for the first time. So you don't have a glut of units at 80% AMI, you have a range of units serving a broader range of New York City families, from, extremely low incomes up to, maybe 80 or 90% or something like that. But we are super excited about that in the medium and high density districts. Our little thought experiment, if this had been in place since 2014, we would have an additional 20,000 income restricted units at those lower AMIs that serve actual New York City families who are struggling to afford the rent.
I'm going with the second row right here behind. Yep. Yes, you're welcome. And then we'll. No, I saw you.
My question is, and I'm here as a double person. I'm a member of Community Board 9. I've been on it on and off for over 15 years. I'm also a housing organizer with Goddard Riverside Law Project. We do a lot of grassroots knocking on doors in the Upper West Side, Manhattan Valley. You might see me in your building. We're very concerned about rent stabilized. You say they're dropping because people are dying. And that's how they're being converted. They're living under deplorable conditions. They're not being supported. They're basically being kicked out. There's a lot of illegal things happening in pre-war buildings. Preservation talks about architecture, the physical structure. We're trying to preserve people in our community, as many of you have pointed, are the culture. They are what makes a neighborhood, what makes New York. What is the plan to preserve people in their housing? 1. 2, you mentioned community board, you all do, as the process. Community boards do not represent or reflect the full community. They are 56 people, many of whom are there to preserve their self-interests. What are you doing to reach every single block and get people's opinion block by block? Or what are you going to enforce on community boards that they actually start doing outreach block by block? Because that's not happening on community boards. And I'm just here to say I love being on Community Board 9, but we do not do the work of advocacy. We represent to the city. Advocacy and door-to-door knocking is what's needed now to inform people of their rights and what's happening in New York. Just saying.
Before John answers, I just want to let you know that's the last question, and then we'll be wrapping up for lunch. Go ahead, John.
Great question. Love Goddard Riverside. Love the work you do. Another initiative in housing opportunity is to re-legalize shared housing, smaller housing that may be appropriate for younger households, older households, marginally housed households. It'll enable us to re-legalize some informal SRO arrangements that we see around the city and preserve them for the folks who live there. With groups like AFI, we'd love to brief Goddard Riverside as well if we haven't already. I can't remember whether we did. So there's that. Working extremely closely with HPD on the absolutely crucial, essential preservation of affordable housing piece. Because like I said in my previous answer, preserving neighborhoods, preserving buildings for people is our end goal here, I think, that we can agree on. As for reaching, the members of the public beyond the community board, in addition to briefing every single group with every single constituency from the very in favor to the very opposed, we are also holding a series of public info sessions. I think we've had about 4 so far. They're typically in the evening. We've done overviews of the proposal, and then we're doing each month, we're breaking it down into different components. Our next proposal on missing middle is on March 27th, and then we have another overview the following month on April 21st, I believe. Those are all recorded. They're all online. Come one, come all. We've had hundreds of attendees. And it's really hard to reach everybody to make folks come to meetings like this or make folks come to briefings. But gosh darn it, we're trying to get as many folks as we can to be as transparent as possible, so that ultimately we can get folks comfortable to get this over the top. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for having.